Excited to chat again. This is our third time making a recording like this. And I told you before our call, this book, The Energy Paradox, is my favorite of the three I've read. I know you did another book years before. I haven't gotten a hold of that one yet, but this has got a lot of new stuff in it, and it definitely had me captivated. But where I want to start is why write about energy? What drew you into this topic?
Well, it's a funny story, but it's worth telling. I was driving down to Orange County to do a fundraising video for public television and help them make some money. And there was a person who was going to interview me and do the pitch. And I got a call on the cell phone that this particular young lady wasn't going to make it in because she basically didn't have the energy to come in today. And I said, well, what are we going to do? And they said, well, don't worry, we'll get somebody else. But that the idea that she didn't have it in her to come in that day really haunted me for several days. And I went, this is a millennial, and how do you not have it in you to come to work? And I realized that over the last 21 years in my practice, I see tons of people with fatigue and malaise and tiredness, and I just hadn't added it all up that we're in an energy crisis. And she just kind of brought it home to me. So I wasn't planning to write the book. And I said, I think I'm going to write a book about energy. So that's how it all started.
Got it. And Dr. Gundry, for you, has energy been something that's ebbed and flowed over the years? I know you have your own health journey that, at one point you're overweight and you've gotten healthy, lost a lot of weight. Where along that journey have you had troubles with energy?
Well, it's funny. I, because I was a heart surgeon for most of my career, you have to kind of suck it up and find, the way to keep going. But one of the interesting things looking back is, when you've got a little baby's life in your hands, you have to suck it up. But most of us, I think, get the idea that our modern lifestyle, the stress in our lives, being tired and having to suck it up and power through is normal. And quite frankly, it's not normal. I get to study super old people around the world. And one of the striking things is that a lot of these cultures, particularly hunter-gatherer cultures, they don't even have words for being tired. They don't have words for fatigue. And I joke that I've chased a 90-year-old up a hillside herding sheep, and they're going faster than I am, and I'm going, where's all this coming from? So we've got this distorted view that being tired is something that's normal, and we have to overcome it with double espressos and energy drinks, and it's not normal, and that's the whole point of this book. That being tired is not normal.
And for you, somebody that works with patients, I know it's a select population, it's a specific population, a lot of people that are sick and looking to get better. But how often, when somebody comes through your door to work with you, is energy part of their complaint?
That's a great question. Early on, I would see people, and there's a diagnostic code. We have to code to get paid by insurance. And there's a diagnosis code called fatigue and malaise. And over 50% of my patients that would see me initially, and these were across the board patients, we would use the code fatigue and malaise. So it's and that I became so used to that, and then seeing fatigue and malaise go away, that as part of our program, that it really never even occurred to me that my program was actually eliminating fatigue and tiredness. And so when I was prompted to look at this, I said, my gosh, I've actually been an energy doctor my entire career at doing this. So it's a huge factor. What I've also seen, which has surprised me, I guess, through the years, is about 70, 80% of my practice is autoimmune disease. And autoimmune diseases in general almost always associate with fatigue and tiredness and malaise, if not worse, brain fog. But autoimmune diseases in people in their 50s and 60s and 70s is not unusual. But as you probably know, Jesse, we're seeing autoimmune diseases in teenagers. We're seeing it in 20-year-olds, 30-year-olds. I see tons of millennials now who have brain fog and tiredness. In fact, just before we got off the phone, I saw a young 27-year-old woman who's in graduate school with not only an autoimmune disease that we're working on, but she just can't get through the day. And 27 years old, and you can't get through the day. And so this is an epidemic that we need to address, and it's addressable. That's the good news.
And as an epidemic, is this something relatively new that's affected us, or is this go all the way back to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution and shift work and that type of thing? Is there any research you've looked at, you know, seeing, determining, I should say, how relatively new of a phenomenon this is?
Well, if you just look at, for instance, autoimmune diseases were so rare back when I was in medical school, of course, back in the dark ages, that the tests we used looking for autoimmune diseases were called funny tests because it was so odd to go looking for autoimmune diseases that the tests were kind of funny. Yeah, we just would rarely order them. Now, for instance, as many as 60 million Americans may have Hashimoto's thyroiditis, which is, a low thyroid condition, which is an autoimmune disease. And um, Kelly Clarkson made me famous because she reversed her Hashimoto's with my program, the Plant Paradox. But so this is all new stuff. This young lady um, having, for instance, rheumatoid arthritis. At a young age, she was diagnosed over 10 years ago with rheumatoid arthritis in her teenage years, and this is once so rare. And you don't see all these commercials every night on TV for immunosuppressive drugs to treat your psoriasis, your rheumatoid arthritis, your Crohn's disease, your colitis, your whatever autoimmune disease. Every other commercial are for these immunosuppressive drugs. And they're not there because these drug companies are nice people. They're there because they know that there's an epidemic and people, want to use these drugs, which in my humble opinion is asking for trouble. Number one, I got into this as a transplant immunologist doing heart transplants. And as I assure all my patients with autoimmune disease, you don't have a heart transplant in you, so what the heck are you doing on a heart transplant drug? And that actually usually gets their attention.
Well, let's get into the minutia and discuss what is happening. What's causing this epidemic?
So one of the biggest changes that has happened in the last 15 years, and certainly in my practice, is I think most of us are now in agreement that leaky gut underlies almost all chronic diseases, and certainly leaky gut underlies autoimmune diseases. And if you had asked me 15 years ago what I thought about, leaky gut, I probably would have told you it's pseudoscience. But now, really, thanks to work by people like Dr. Fasano, who's now at Harvard, who I've been on some panels with, uh, there's now very concrete evidence that a leaky gut underlies almost all chronic diseases, including autoimmune diseases and being tired and having fatigue. And I think it's worth going into why that happens. As I talk about in the book, there's a fascinating study, and I've had the authors of the study on my podcast, the Dr. Gundry podcast, where some Duke researchers wanted to look at the energy expenditure of one of the last remaining hunter-gatherer populations in the world, the Hadzas in Tanzania. And they wanted to compare the energy expenditure of these people to the typical office desk worker. And of course, they had a hypothesis that these Hadza, the men walk, 8 to 10 miles every day in search of game. The women walk 3 to 5 miles every day gathering berries and tubers. And they're very fit, they're very lean, they're very healthy, they don't have any chronic diseases. And compare these to the office workers. And their hypothesis was, well, no wonder these guys are so fit and they're so skinny and they're so healthy. It's because they're burning up lots of energy. And lo and behold, they found that the Hadzas were using the exact same amount of energy as the desk workers. And whenever we researchers have a hypothesis and our data doesn't meet our hypothesis, usually we change our hypothesis. But some researchers say, no, the hypothesis is correct. So these researchers said, well, of course, this is true because humans have a fixed amount of energy we're going to expend, and it doesn't matter whether you're a Hadza or a desk worker, you're going to expend the same amount of energy. And I went, wait a minute, that doesn't pass the sniff test as far as I can tell. So why do the desk workers have this huge energy expenditure as if they're walking around all day? Well, it's because if you have a leaky gut, particles in the foods we eat, and we can talk about lectins all you want, but pieces of bacteria, other undigested food particles, literally can leak through the wall of our gut, and it's easier than most people think. On the other side of the wall of our gut is about 80% of all of our immune system, all of our white blood cells are lined up along this border because that's where mischief can come across. And as they attack these particles, we produce inflammation. And inflammation is literally a fire of this war going on between things coming across our border that shouldn't and our soldiers, our immune system, fighting them. And in any war, soldiers need a lot of supplies. They need a lot of food. And what we do is we actually divert supplies, we divert energy from our muscles, from our brain, into this battle. And most of us, if we're lucky, feel it. Other people don't even know it's happening. But so it's no wonder that these desk workers who honestly are eating a standard American diet, which is the perfect way to produce leaky gut, as I've written about before, they're burning up with the fire of inflammation, like I talk about in the book. They're using huge amounts of energy as if they were walking 8 to 10 miles every day. And that is actually the explanation on why the desk workers are using so much energy. It's for the wrong purpose.
So let me just try and summarize this briefly here. So it's the wrong type of food coming in, causing leaky gut, and then the energy required by the immune system to fight the food particles and things that are getting through the gut into the rest of the body.
Yeah, in fact, if you think about the last time food was rationed was during World War II. And why did we have food rationing? Well, it's because our troops needed, these supplies, this food far more than, those of us who were back on the home front. And so we rationed food so that the troops had the food. And our body does the exact same thing. Our body says, we only have so much food and we've got a war going on. So we're going to ration the muscles. We're going to ration the brain, which are the big giant food hogs normally. And we're going to give it to the immune system because they need it. And it's that's where all of our energy going, number one. So leaky gut is a huge factor in all of this.
Okay. So, by the sounds of it, we're going to have to take it a step back and look at what we're putting in our body. So, you mentioned lectins there. I can't talk to Dr. Gundry without getting into lectins at least a little bit. I know we've talked about them in the past, but let's talk about lectins and some of the other big offenders that are causing the issue.
Yeah, so I talk about there's really kind of three L's that are driving our energy crisis, and the first L is leaky gut. The second L is lectins, and lectins are part of the plant defense system against being eaten. And briefly, plants don't particularly want to be eaten. They certainly don't want their seeds, their babies, to be eaten. But their defense system, they can't run, they can't hide, they can't fight, as they are chemists of incredible ability. So they make sticky proteins that are called lectins. And these sticky proteins are actually designed to create leaky gut. And this was actually Dr. Fasano's research that proved that lectins cause leaky gut. Gluten happens to be a lectin, and gluten is way up there on the things that can cause leaky gut. The idea from a plant standpoint is that if you produce leaky gut, then this person, your predator, is going to have inflammation, is going to feel bad, is going to have not is failing to thrive. And the smart predator says, gee, every time I eat these certain plants, my get up and go is got up and gone, like the book says. I don't feel good. I'm not reproducing right. I'm not going to eat these things. Plant wins, the animal wins, everybody's happy. Humans, unfortunately, are really stupid. And when we eat these things, we take antacids, which are their own troublemaker. We take Aleve or Advil, which are their own troublemakers, and we just compound the problem. So the third factor in all of this is what I call LPSs, lipopolysaccharides. And in my books, we call them little pieces of shit, because they actually are bacterial cell walls that can actually hop on fats, particularly fats, saturated fats, which are incredibly prevalent in our diet, and literally ride through the wall of our gut. And our immune system doesn't know the piece of bacteria from a living bacteria and assumes it's being invaded by bacteria. And so these three L's are the big drivers of our modern massive inflammation that goes on.
Let's stick on the LPS here for a bit and get into the nitty gritty on that. So, why is LPS created? Is that something our body's creating, or why is it there? And you mentioned saturated fat. Saturated fat, at least in moderation, can be considered, from a good source, part of a healthy diet. So, what do we do if that is part of our healthy diet to not have this issue?
So normally we have, 100 trillion bacteria at any time in our gut. And those bacteria are growing and dividing, and bacteria die. And certain bacteria, certain dead bacteria, the walls are LPSs. And so those LPSs, interestingly enough, in general, can't get through the wall of our gut normally. But through, for lack of a better word, a design flaw, long chain fatty acids, like most saturated fats, are absorbed through the wall of our gut on a carrier molecule called a chylomicron. And LPSs actually hide in this chylomicron and get through the wall of our gut without being discovered. And so they hitch a ride secretly. And so, interestingly enough, the more saturated fats you have in your diet, the more likely are that LPSs are going to be hitching rides through the wall of your gut. And that's why, and I agree with some of the, fat phobic doctors that one of the ways a low fat diet may have some benefit, and don't get me wrong, I'm not a low fat diet fan, is that these people are not getting LPSs coming through the wall of their gut. Um, but you're right. There are different forms of fats, and there are different forms of saturated fats. I'm a huge fan of short and medium chain fatty acids. Many people know these as um, butyrate is a short chain fatty acid that I talk about extensively in the book as a postbiotic, and maybe we'll get into that a little bit later. And medium chain fatty acid, medium chain triglycerides, most people know them. They don't get absorbed with chylomicrons, so LPSs can't hop on those guys. So,
So that all makes sense. So coming back to again, if somebody is going to include some saturated fat as part of a healthy diet, are they just basically screwed? Like, are they going to have the LPS coming through, or is it about repopulating that gut microbiome with better bacteria so you don't have those cell walls that are coming through? Just a little bit of hope for the omnivores out there that are eating good quality animal products that are going to have some saturated fat.
so yes and yes. So there's really good evidence that you can take healthy volunteers and you can take LPSs, which are not living bacteria, they are pieces of bacterial cell wall. And you can inject them into a volunteer's bloodstream, and that volunteer will go into septic shock. Their blood pressure will plummet. They will act as if they were infected with living bacteria because your immune system cannot tell the difference. And that's pretty exciting. Uh, Wim Hof, the Iceman, who I've had on my podcast, has shown that through his breathing techniques, he and those who he taught can withstand getting injected with LPSs without having septic shock. And so, one of the things that's interesting, and I talk about this in the book, is we want to teach our immune system through not having leaky gut that things that are going to come across our border may not be as bad as they appear, and just kind of relax. On the other hand, if our immune system is hyperactivated because stuff is coming across our leaky gut all the time, then things that otherwise may not be that bad, we overreact to. Let me give you a classic example of that. 95% of humans are born with an antibody, and we now know lots about antibodies because of COVID-19, are born with a preformed antibody against the peanut lectin. So 95% of us have an antibody that says this little lectin is a troublemaker. And yet, when I was growing up, nobody had a peanut allergy. Peanuts were everywhere. No kid was carrying an EpiPen to school because some kid might have peanut butter on his sandwich. What happened? Well, it's because back then, most of us didn't have leaky gut. Most of our immune systems weren't hyperactivated to look at anything foreign and get all riled up about it. So even though most of us had an antibody against peanuts, our immune system yeah, I know that guy. He's not a real troublemaker. But now our immune systems are always on guard 24 hours a day. So even an LPS, which 50 years ago might not have been a big thing, now is, oh my gosh, we're under attack. And on the same vein, most of us now have been preaching that the reason people with pre-existing conditions are such a setup for a bad outcome with COVID-19 is because those people inadvertently have leaky gut as the cause of their pre-existing condition. and their immune systems are hyper activated. And so when they get something like COVID-19, they get this cytokine storm, which would normally not happen if your immune system was in its normal functioning status. And I've been preaching this for over a year now, is that, Hippocrates said 2,500 years ago, all disease begins in the gut. And we now know that all chronic diseases begin in the gut, and they begin from chronic inflammation, and that chronic inflammation is coming from leaky gut.
I want to get to leaky gut and how we can fix it. But first, let's come back to lectins. And you've talked about gluten, you've talked about lectin from peanuts. What other lectins do we have to be aware of?
So the major lectins are usually on the hulls of grains. So brown rice has a major lectin, quinoa has a major lectin, buckwheat has a major lectin. There's only two grains that have no hulls, and they are millet and sorghum. So they actually are lectin free, and they're perfectly safe to eat. The nightshade family, the peels and seeds of tomatoes, eggplant, bell peppers, and potatoes, and even goji berries are another big source of lectins. Peanuts are not a nut, they're a bean, and cashews are not a nut. And cashews have a number of lectins that are really mischievous. So beans in general have some of the highest lectin content of any food. That's why if you have a slow cooker at home, when you bought your slow cooker, there was a label on the slow cooker saying, warning, do not cook beans in the slow cooker, because there is not enough temperature to destroy the lectins in beans. Pressure cooking, on the other hand, destroys almost all lectins except for gluten. And pressure cooking will not break the gluten protein.
So let's get into how serious this is. I mean, what if I go over to a friend's house, I'm being served, a healthy meal that I know is containing lectins? Is this an all or nothing thing, or is it like, okay, I'm having one meal, and getting other benefits, being with community, like I can go back to my regular low lectin plan later. Basically, how many lectins does it take to cause issues like with leaky gut?
Yeah, so that depends. And it depends really on a number of factors that I've written about in the plant paradox. Normally, if you were a traditional culture, number one, you would prepare foods to detoxify lectins, either through fermentation processes or multiple soakings and changes of water and long, prolonged cooking. And traditional cultures have always figured this out. For instance, the Italians always peel and de-seed their tomatoes before they make tomato sauce, because they've learned that that's where, the lectins are. On the other hand, most traditional cultures have a really robust, diverse microbiome, and the microbiome is a major defensive wall against lectins. The bugs actually like lectins. We actually have bacteria that enjoy eating gluten, thinks gluten's delicious. And our widespread use of antibiotics, either that we personally have taken or that's in most of our animal products, has wiped out the diversity of our microbiome. So we're now on the fourth string defensive line, and all of our first, second, and third stringers are out injured or on the injured reserve list. And it's no wonder, the linebackers are sacking my quarterback every time, because we just don't have those defense systems. And, you know, yeah, it's a war between plants and their predators, and it's actually a pretty doggone good balance. Now, to answer your question, um, most of us, if we have a diverse microbiome, if we don't have leaky gut, can withstand the occasional assault from heavy lectin containing foods. But what's so fascinating with my practice in autoimmune disease patients is one little harmless cheat usually sets us back wide open. And that's unfortunate, but it's how folks with autoimmune disease have to play the game. But again, getting back to the energy paradox, the more we can actually have a diverse microbiome, the more we can give our microbiome the things they want to eat, the better our defense system is.
I really want to get into the microbiome in a deep way. But first, let's talk about a specific lectin we brought up a couple times, and that's gluten. And in the book, you talk about how, and I'm guessing this is for a healthy individual, you don't recommend totally cutting that out of the diet. Talk about why that is.
Well, again, we do have gluten eating bacteria that would normally be a part of our microbiome. And I've seen a number of people who, have the severe forms of gluten intolerance, celiac disease, that have eliminated gluten in their diet, but then gluten sneaks back into their diet. And quite honestly, I'm friends with a number of James Beard Award-winning chefs, and to a person, they will tell me and you that you cannot eat gluten-free in a restaurant. It's impossible, even if your waiter tells you that the restaurant can do gluten-free. And I won't go into why that is, but it's pretty true. So inadvertently, most of us are exposed to gluten, even small amounts of it in our daily lives. So that if you don't have a set of gluten eating bugs, for instance, you're a setup for even this tiny amount of gluten to cause you trouble. So again, the more we can fortify our microbiome, the more, diversity we can promote, the better off we are to protect ourselves with what's going to come through our mouths.
Okay. And tying together, I'm guessing these tie together, the microbiome and leaky gut. When somebody knows they're suffering from this and they're going to fix that issue, is the microbiome the first area that you go to and assess with that patient the status of the microbiome and then help repopulate that?
So, no. In fact, like I talk about in all my books, the first step number one is it's not what I tell you to eat that's important. Number one, it's what I tell you not to eat, because we can eat anti-inflammatory foods, we can take all these probiotics, but if we're constantly introducing lectins whose job it is to create leaky gut, then we're barking up the wrong tree. So job one is to get these foods out of your diet. Now, job two is to get a healthy microbiome. And the part of the book that's kind of exciting is most people have heard about probiotics, friendly bacteria. And a lot of people are beginning to understand prebiotics. Prebiotics are the foods that probiotics eat. And when I tell all my patients, look, if I have a choice of giving you probiotics or prebiotics, I'll spend my money uh, getting prebiotics rather than probiotics. And let me give you an example that I use here in Palm Springs in the desert. So let's suppose I sell my patients grass seed and say, here, go plant your grass seed. And they come back a month later and said, you sold me bad grass seed because it didn't grow. And I said, well, what'd you do with it? And they said, well, I went out and I threw it on the sand and it didn't grow. And I went, well, did you water it? And they said, well, no, you didn't tell me to. Did you fertilize it? No, you didn't tell me to. And I'm going, well, of course it didn't grow. But most of us say, oh, I'm taking all these probiotics and I've got 100 billion CFUs, and nothing's happening. Well, did you feed it what they needed to eat? Did you take care of them by giving them what they need? No. What does that have to do with it? These guys have to have something to eat, and they're prebiotics. And why we need to feed them is they produce postbiotics. And one of the revelations of the book is that postbiotics are why we need probiotics, why we need prebiotics, is so that we can actually benefit from this communication system between the gut microbiome and our energy producing organelles, the mitochondria, our brain, our genes. And that's really exciting stuff.
Okay, so step one, we're stopping with the lectins and things that are causing the leaky gut. I guess I assume we're all on the same page with that before getting to step two. Like I mentioned, repopulating the microbiome and building a strong microbiome. So once we've done that, well, let's not move beyond that. Let's stick with this postbiotics because this is something I hadn't heard of until reading this book. And I want to go deeper into it and talk about that communication between the bacteria in our guts with the mitochondria in our bodies and other cells. So, first of all, how is that happening?
So, um, bacteria and actually fungi love to, eat prebiotic fiber, and they ferment that prebiotic fiber. And the gases, among other things, that are produced by this fermentation are a system of literally a language, and it's called the trans-kingdom communication system between the gut microbiome and the rest of us. And lo and behold, what we would have normally considered one of the side products of eating, which is producing farts, um, was actually incredibly important for our overall well-being, for our energy production, for our mental health, for preventing dementia, and we can, get into that. But simple things like hydrogen gas, which the Hindenburg was full of, a flammable gas. Um, we we laugh when I was growing up in Boy Scouts. We would we ate a lot of beans on camping trips, and we produced a lot of gas. And it was common that you would light a Bic lighter and light your fart. Boy Scouts did that, I guess. And we were lighting hydrogen gas, and it was pretty cool. And it turns out that hydrogen gas is the smallest molecule there is. It instantly diffuses through the wall of our gut and goes into our bloodstream. And little did we know that this hydrogen gas actually is used in mitochondria to produce energy. And shockingly, one of the most wild findings recently was in Japan, where they took a bunch of people with Parkinson's, which, as many people know, is now an epidemic in a neurodegenerative disease. It's a cousin of Alzheimer's. And they took people with Parkinson's and they looked at their microbiome, and they found that these people with Parkinson's didn't have a microbiome that produced hydrogen gas. And they compared this to people who didn't have Parkinson's, and lo and behold, those people had a microbiome that produced hydrogen gas. So then they said, that's really interesting. We're going to give these people with Parkinson's hydrogen water. And you can actually dissolve hydrogen in water. I even have a supplement at Gundry MD that's called H2 Restore, which is a tablet that produces hydrogen water. And they had people drink hydrogen water if they had Parkinson's. And lo and behold, their Parkinson's got better. just by reintroducing hydrogen gas into their system. And you go, holy cow, you mean to tell me that this crazy, molecule that's produced as a part of, prebiotic fiber being fermented by our microbiome has that much power to, affect our neurons. So that actually prompted a whole look at all these gases, and some of them are other common gases like hydrogen sulfide. That's the rotten egg smell. And originally, hydrogen sulfide was thought to be toxic. And lo and behold, as I've talked about in all my other books, there's an effect called hormesis, and that's a summary of Nietzsche's famous line, "That which doesn't kill me makes me stronger." And another way of describing it is the dose makes the poison. And so I call it the Goldilocks rule in the energy paradox, where none of something, let's consider hydrogen sulfide, is not very good. Some of something, a little bit of hydrogen sulfide, is really good for you, really good for your mitochondria, really good for your brain. And too much of something, like a lot of hydrogen sulfide, will kill you. And it's finding that Goldilocks just right that is part of the book teaching people what to do. So hydrogen sulfide in the right amount is really good for you. Here's another shocker. Methane, that, greenhouse gas that cows are farting, turns out to be in a very important communication system in us between our microbiome and our mitochondria. So all these things, believe it or not, like I say in the book, step on the gas. Let's really, thank flatulence for something that it's got a bad rap for.
And how do we go about assessing whether or not this is working properly in our system? Is it just, are you farting? Are you not farting? Like, is there something objective we can look at to know if we're in that Goldilocks zone?
Well, so that's a great question. What one of the things we have found and others have found in our modern diet is our modern diet has been stripped of almost all fibrous containing foods. And it's been stripped because ultra processed foods, one of the things we have removed from foods in heavy milling processes is we've been removing most of the fiber. And most of the foods that contain fiber are now a very small part of any of our diet. The bare minimum for fiber that the government sets is about 25 grams of fiber every day. Most Americans, if they're lucky, maybe get 5 grams of fiber in their diet. If you look at hunter-gatherers like the Hadzas, they get 150 grams of fiber every day in their diet. And it's that fiber that's actually converted into postbiotics. So it's no wonder that we have epidemics of Parkinson's and dementia, and we have epidemics of Crohn's and colitis because we're not producing these postbiotic gases that are so important. So getting fiber back into our diet is one of the mainstays of the energy paradox. And it's actually pretty doggone easy to do.
And when we're talking about fiber, I know they're soluble and insoluble. Are we looking for a certain ratio between the two? Are all fibers from plant material? Well, again, there's obviously the two different types, but are we looking for like a diversity from different fruits and vegetables, or is it just getting to that certain threshold?
So, yeah, diversity is good. But for instance, most insoluble fiber, which we think of as whole grains, that insoluble fiber is where the lectins are. And there's some very cool research that I've referenced in other books, that it's insoluble fiber that irritates the lining of your gut, that causes leaky gut. And the reason insoluble fiber actually increases your bowel movements is because they are irritants, and we are actually trying to get them out of our system. And sadly, this was, and I go into this in the book. There was a famous English colon surgeon by the name of Dennis Burkitt, who was sent on a mission trip to Africa to help the poor Africans with their colon cancer and with their hemorrhoids, which was, you know, big in England. And he got down to Africa, and this was in the middle 20th century. And he got down to Africa, and he couldn't find any colon cancer, and he couldn't find any hemorrhoids. And so he was kind of, at a loss of what to do. And he says, well, where the heck's all the colon cancer? Where's the hemorrhoids? And he started looking at what these African tribes were eating, and they were eating huge amounts of tubers and, yams and sweet potatoes. And he started following them out into the bush and looking at their bowel movements. And they had huge bowel movements, like termite mounds. And he became fascinated with these bowel movements. And he came back to England. And he says, oh my gosh, I've discovered, why people don't get colon cancer, why they're so healthy, why they're so skinny. It's fiber. Well, England didn't have a lot of tubers laying around, but they had plenty of insoluble fiber in their grains. And he didn't know the difference between soluble fiber and insoluble fiber. So he's really the father of the insoluble fiber is good for you. And of course, grain companies, cereal companies have run with this and have said, oh, fiber is fiber is fiber, and here's where you get your fiber. And it's one of the major undoers of our health is because we've been convinced that insoluble fiber is the key to health. But what Burkitt actually discovered was that it was insoluble fiber that was the key to these Africans' health. And so where is soluble fiber found? Well, it's found in, for instance, one of the easiest ways to do it is grind up some flax seeds loaded with soluble fiber. Grind up some psyllium powder loaded with soluble fiber. Easy to do. I'll be happy to sell you Prebio Thrive, which has 8 soluble fibers. On the other hand, asparagus, which is in season right now, is full of soluble fiber. The chicory family vegetables, radicchio, that Italian red lettuce, it's not a lettuce at all, Belgian endive, these are in most stores, full of soluble fiber. The tubers, like yams and sweet potatoes, like jicama, another great source. And then there's, these go into the resistant starches. And resistant starches are, as the name implies, are more resistant to our breaking them down into soluble sugar molecules. And so a lot of this resistant starch arrives lower down in our intestines, where our gut buddies are more than happy to munch on it. So those are just a few examples of where to find soluble fibers.
Got it. And for the average person, say they're eating a heavy plant-based diet, including some of the foods you mentioned that are good sources of soluble fiber, do you find to get to a healthy amount of fiber in a day, people often have to use a product like the one you talked about that, an actual supplement or taking the flax and grinding it up and adding that to the diet? We'll use you for an example. Is that something that you do on top of what you're eating?
Yeah, I do, because again, the more I research this area, the more I really want to make postbiotics. The effect, the power of postbiotics is just fantastic. On the other hand, I eat a very heavy, plant-centric diet. I'm a plant predator. I make no bones about it. But you got to know which plants are your buddies and are going to help you out, and which plants don't have your back. And so, if you follow me around, you'll see me eating. For instance, I'll eat a lot of tricalory salads, which are arugula and Belgian endive and radicchio, which is just everywhere in Italy and France. And these salads didn't come about just by accident. People, found that their health was actually improved by eating these things. So, um, but an easy way to start is, most of us unfortunately don't have a very, very varied diet. Most of us are almost too busy to cook. Um, Research that I did years ago show that the average American chooses 5 meals and sticks with those 5 meals on a rotating basis. And the average hunter-gatherer is eating 250 different plant species on a rotating basis. And even my, organic vegetable eaters, you're not eating 250 different species. So the more diversity of these prebiotics we can get into us, the better. And one of the fascinating things is that polyphenols, which are these plant compounds that I'm so big on in all of my writing, polyphenols are actually prebiotics. And polyphenols are beneficial because they are actually prebiotics for our bacteria. So,
Let's talk a little bit more about polyphenols. What are your top sources? I know olive oil is something that you love, and you're quoted as saying food is something that we use to get more olive oil in our
yeah, the
bodies.
only purpose of food is to get olive oil in your mouth, correct?
There you go. So that I know you're a coffee fan as well. So talk about some of your top sources of polyphenols.
Yeah, surprisingly, polyphenols are in some of really our most popular foods. And what's interesting, as I talk about in the book, is that it's probably the polyphenol content of these healthy foods that are actually explain their benefits. So, for instance, coffee is loaded with polyphenols. And interestingly enough, there's really very good research that shows that 5 cups of black coffee a day is preventative of developing Parkinson's disease, for example. And interestingly enough, the most potent coffee is Turkish boiled coffee, where the grounds are literally sitting in contact with the coffee kind of throughout the day. And that's because more polyphenols are extracted. Uh, the more polyphenols in olive oil, the better. There's nothing particularly great or beneficial about oleic acid, which is the major long chain fatty acid in olive oil. It's the olive oil is a carrier of polyphenols, and in one of my earlier books, more bitter, more better. The bitterness is actually the polyphenols. And so if olive oil makes you cough, that's actually the effect of the polyphenol. So I'm always looking for, strangely enough, olive oils that make me cough because that's a higher polyphenol content. Chocolate. Chocolate's benefit is actually in the polyphenols. And the darker the chocolate, the more polyphenols. Sadly, the Dutch learned how to deactivate the polyphenols in chocolate with the Dutch process. And so if you see Dutched cocoa, run away. All the polyphenols have been inactivated. So extra dark chocolate's a great way to get polyphenols into your system. Red wine, another great source of multiple polyphenols, resveratrol, quercetin. And then in the book, another fascinating finding is that melatonin is maybe one of the greatest plant-produced compounds that explains a lot of the Mediterranean diet's benefit. So melatonin, we all think of the sleep molecule that's produced in our pineal gland that puts us to sleep. And yes, melatonin does go up, during sleep. But melatonin is actually the major antioxidant that's used in our mitochondria to sop up all the damage that's done in the production of energy. And we get deep into the weeds about how ATP is produced in the book. But the important thing is melatonin is the major antioxidant. And surprise, surprise, plants produce melatonin to protect their mitochondria from the damage of sunlight. And so plants don't need to go to sleep, but plants produce melatonin to protect their mitochondria. And we have a whole list of really great melatonin producing plants. So, for instance, pistachios are the highest melatonin containing food that you can find. Mushrooms are right up there with high melatonin producing containing compounds, as well as being polyphenols. Red wine, surprise, surprise, has melatonin in it, and so does olive oil. And I conjecture in the book that it could be that the benefits of the Mediterranean diet with olive oil and mushrooms and red wine is not so much these other polyphenols, but it's the high, actually, melatonin content. And surprise, coffee has melatonin.
So interesting. I was going to bring up the melatonin. I'm glad you went there. So, to make sure I have this right, the melatonin supports the mitochondria, which are our power plants, our energy producers. So, when we're talking about energy, we want to consume some of those foods. Is it on a daily basis?
Yeah, I actually think the more people understand the rigors that our mitochondria go through to produce our energy currency, which is ATP, uh, you would be shocked that our mitochondria uh, don't just give up. And I use the examples that our mitochondria are essential workers, and the amount of work that mitochondria have to do to produce energy and the amount of byproducts, if you want to say, um, uh, the sludge that builds up in our oil in an internal combustion engine is the sludge that builds up in our mitochondria in producing energy. And we have to have a very impressive way of sopping up the free radicals, the reactive oxygen species that occur in the energy production process. And if people realize the damage that we do to our mitochondria on a daily basis, it's no wonder that these cultures that eat a lot of melatonin containing foods do better in the long run and don't have, our chronic diseases.
So far, when we've talked about mitochondria, we've talked about the postbiotics and their influence on the mitochondria. And now we're talking about melatonin and that supporting the mitochondria as well. I want to go deeper into the mitochondria because again, these are our energy power plants within our body creating energy. What else can we do to support them?
So, one of the other, I think, revelations of the book that surprises most people is so our mitochondria are actually engulfed bacteria that 2 billion years ago got eaten by other single celled organisms. And in the exchange for finding a nice, comfy, warm place to live inside a cell, and in exchange for giving food to eat by that cell, the mitochondria produced energy, ATP. And that actually formed what's called a eukaryotic cell. And there won't be a test after this podcast, I promise. Uh, so that ATP, we produce 140 pounds of ATP every day just at rest. And, people look around and go, wait a minute, I don't eat 140 pounds of food. How in the world? And I don't weigh 140 pounds. What do you mean? Where is it? And the answer is we spend it. This is our energy currency, and we are spending it. So mitochondria have the job of taking the sugars we eat, the proteins we eat, which turn into amino acids, and the fats we eat, which turn into fatty acids, and combining them with oxygen and producing ATP, adenosine triphosphate, our energy currency. And they do this in what's called the electron transport chain. And we won't get deep into the weeds, but the mitochondria are really good at taking one thing at a time, whether it's glucose, whether it's amino acids, or whether it's free fatty acids, and kind of running it down a gauntlet and producing ATP. But they're not really good at taking sugars and proteins and fats simultaneously and trying to do the same thing. And what happens to most of us is that the way we eat with our processed foods, with our energy drinks, with our energy foods, simultaneously to most of our mitochondria, we've got sugars, proteins, and fats trying to get in and get processed by mitochondria all at once. And I liken it to rush hour traffic and freeways. And you have all these cars, all these buses, all these trucks converging into freeways. And as anyone in rush hour, and I'm in the LA area, knows, everything grinds to a halt and tempers flare, and we have ways of trying to stop all this from happening. We have stoplights on entrance ramps. We have high-speed lanes, but things grind to a halt. And what's happened to us is that our mitochondria no longer can produce energy smoothly because it's literally rush hour traffic, kind of from the minute we start eating early in the morning to the minute we stop eating late at night. And no wonder our energy production has ground to a halt, because we literally are at a standstill because of everything we're throwing at our mitochondria to process.
So what I'm gathering here, there's two different problems. We're constantly overwhelming the mitochondria by, snacking and then eating, one meal after the next. And then two, we're combining fat, sugar, and protein at the same time.
Yep.
So I can see how the first there, how we could, spread out our meals, and we're going to get into time restricted eating, and how we can give, our mitochondria a break. But you talk about this in the book, how you recommend starting the first meal of the day with one of these macronutrients. And
Right.
I can get behind that. That makes sense. And you shared a recipe in the book that I'm excited to try with the avocado and the egg yolk. And I think you drizzle some olive oil over it. It sounded delicious. So I'm
It's
excited to try
really
that one.
good. It's really good.
Can't wait to try it. But so I can get with that, how the first meal you could do that. But what about your dinner? Like, I mean, say you have a healthy grass-fed, grass-finished, moderate-sized piece of steak, some sweet potato. Maybe you put some olive oil over the sweet potato. There, you're gonna have protein, fat, and sugar. So,
But
explain that.
you're eating it whole. And that's what our great grandparents did. And unfortunately, we didn't listen to them. Way back when, 50 years ago, 70 years ago, we ate whole foods. We ate our steak whole. We ate our sweet potato whole. We ate our asparagus whole. And these foods are broken down in different time periods. In general, our starches are the first to be broken down into sugar molecules, and those are absorbed, and they reach the mitochondria first. That steak takes actually a really long time to get broken down. And we lose, believe it or not, about 30% of the calories in a steak to heat production. It's very energy intensive. So and it has to be broken down into amino acids to be absorbed. So the protein arrives next, long after, quite frankly, the sugar is gone. Now, fats, like in olive oil, we talked about earlier, they take a really circuitous route to get to your mitochondria. They're absorbed normally on chylomicrons, and rather than going into your bloodstream, they're absorbed into your lymph system and float around your lymph channels and actually enter your bloodstream near the top of your heart. So they take a long time to get to where they're going, and they have to be broken down further before the mitochondria can even use them. So your great grandparents, they had it figured out. They ate foods whole. So the mitochondria go, great, got the sugar coming, got that done. Oh, here comes the protein. Okay, next. Oh, there's the fat. Next. Now what's happened is food companies have figured out, wow, if we break these whole foods down into individual sugar molecules, individual single starches, individual amino acids. Let's grind these proteins up into protein isolates. And let's break these fat molecules down so they can be instantly absorbed. Now, all of a sudden, it's wham, they're all arriving simultaneously to the mitochondria, which has never happened in millions and millions of years because we didn't have the technology to do this. In fact, one fun fact, Kellogg's Corn Flakes was introduced as the first pre-digested meal. Now that sounds really great. Oh, good. My digestion has been done for me. But think about what that means. We've, in a way, taken out the middleman. We've taken out the digestive process. And now this sugar mainlines, to whack into our mitochondria. So thank you, Kellogg's, for, starting what's been the end of our energy by pre-digesting food.
So now I get that. So we need to stick with whole foods. They're going to digest at different rates and your mitochondria won't be overwhelmed. Let's stick on the mitochondria a bit here and talk about, so there's things like eating whole foods, or again we're going to get into time restricted eating here in a bit. So there's things that we can do, but is there ways that we can amp up our mitochondria so they can work better? And two, is there ways that we can help our body produce more mitochondria so that they can, you know, produce more energy when we provide the food and the oxygen?
Yeah, that's what's a lot of the exciting research in time restricted eating, intermittent fasting has to do with everything that you just mentioned. So that's actually a really good segue. First of all, I've been writing about intermittent fasting, time restricted eating longer, I think, than anyone. And I'm welcome to be corrected. So far, no one's come forward to correct me. But in my first book, Dr. Gundry's Diet Evolution, which I wrote in 2006, I actually had an entire chapter about time restricted eating. And my editor, bless her heart, said, this is crazy. This is nutty. And this book is nutty enough. I'm not going to let you do this. We're throwing this chapter out. And I said, no, 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 no. I said, look, I've been doing this now for 6 years. Here's the literature. Here's how it works. You got to let me have it. She says, okay, I'm going to let you have 2 pages to make your case. But, that's all you get. So if you actually get the book, you don't have to. There's 2 pages on time restricted eating. I saw her at Mind Body Green last year before COVID, and she came up to me, Heather Jackson, and she said, first of all, I have to apologize. You were right. You were so far ahead of your time. I should have listened. You've been right about all of this. She said, how did you know way back then? I mean, this is long before the 5-2 diet, long before Jason Fung. How did you know? I said, because, I've been doing this for 6 years and I follow, research and look at my patients and look at me. Anyhow, so why is this so important? Couple reasons. Normally, and we talk about this extensively in the book, your mitochondria need downtime. They need to have time where they don't have to do a lot of work. They need to repair themselves. We talked about the damage that's done constantly. These poor guys trying to make energy. So they need repair time. And what's exciting is that repair process begins to start about 12 hours after you stop eating. It literally takes that long for all the mischief to kind of get cleaned out of your mitochondria. Now, if you think about it, 12 hours would be a fairly routine, way back in the good old days, eating schedule. You might eat breakfast at 8 o'clock in the morning and you might finish dinner at 8 o'clock at night. You would have a 12-hour window, most of the time you're sleeping, to let your mitochondria repair themselves. But work by Dr. Sachin Panda at the Salk Institute in San Diego shows that the vast majority of Americans now eat fairly continuously for 16 hours a day, from the second they get up to the minute they go to bed. So that gives us now an 8-hour for the average American, which doesn't even begin to start to undo the damage, much less repair. And there's a beautiful, getting to the next point, Italian athlete study that I think everybody should read and understand. So mitochondria will repair themselves, will go through downtime if you give them bare minimum of 12 hours. If you stretch that out even farther, two things happen. Number one, the mitochondria have even more time to do repair work. But the really exciting thing is, the longer you stretch this period of time out to, say, about 16 to 18 hours every day, you actually tell the mitochondria to make more of themselves to actually share the workload. And it's called mitogenesis. And it actually has to do with the time that we actually switch over to burning free fatty acids as a fuel. And we go extensively into why most of us can't burn free fatty acids as a fuel. So Italian athletes, they take two groups of Italian athletes. They give them the exact same meals. The one group has to eat a 12-hour window. They eat breakfast at 8 o'clock in the morning. They eat lunch at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. They finish dinner at 8 o'clock at night. The other group, same meals. They eat breakfast at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. They eat lunch at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. They have to finish dinner by 8 o'clock at night. So they're a 7-hour window. Same food, same exercise program. What happens? The folks who eat a 12-hour window, they don't lose any weight. Their muscles are great. Athletic performance is wonderful. The athletes eating a 7-hour window lose weight, even though they're eating the exact same amount of food. And their marker, which I talk a lot about, insulin-like growth factor 1, IGF-1, which is one of the best markers for telling you basically how long you're going to live and how long you're going to live well, goes down, and the other guys don't. So they get this, and their exercise performance is great. So, wow, I get to eat the same amount as these guys who are eating over a 12-hour window. My health markers improve, and I lose weight. Why wouldn't I do that? And it's because these mitochondria have made more of themselves, and they've actually, in a bizarre sort of way, they're taking it easy, but they're making as much energy as before because they've recruited more guys to help them out. It's a win-win.
Interesting. And other than, fasting, is there other ways, different things we can do as part of a healthy lifestyle to increase mitochondrial numbers?
Yeah, so getting back to postbiotics, some of the exciting research in short chain fatty acids like butyrate, and I'm just this huge butyrate fan. Butyrate in and of itself stimulates mitochondrial biogenesis, and butyrate in itself actually tells mitochondria to repair themselves, to protect themselves. So the more butyrate that you can get, produced, and the more short chain fatty acids that you can eat by eating, for instance, fermented foods. Fun fact, vinegar has acetate, which is one of the short chain fatty acids. And who knew that having your apple cider vinegar, you're actually having some short chain fatty acids, and that's how they help your mitochondria. Who knew?
Got it. So you can get them through the diet, or you can also, hopefully, you can do both, but you can maintain your healthy gut microbiome and then they can make them for you.
Yep, exactly.
So let's come back to fasting and talk about how you incorporate this into your life because I know, everybody's different. This isn't follow what Dr. Gundry does and you're going to have the ultimate health or whatnot, but you do have a really tight eating window. I think it's Monday to Friday you eat between it's in the evening and you give
Yeah,
yourself
5 to
2
7
hours,
o'clock. Yeah,
5 to 7, and then on weekends, you allow some more
I take a break.
relaxation on that routine.
Right.
So, talk about why you've chosen that and what somebody new to this might wanna do to start incorporating it.
Okay, so this is actually what I described back in 2006. And during the winter months from January through June, and this is my 21st year of doing this, I eat all my calories in a 2 hour window between 5 and 7. Now, why do I choose that 2 hour window? Because both my wife and I work, and that's when we're home and see each other. If I had it to do differently, I'd probably choose an earlier in the day 2 hour window, but that's how I do it. Uh, so I compress my eating window to 2 hours. So number one, and I eat a full day's worth of calories. I tend to lose about 10 pounds every winter. Every winter. I don't do that every day because you've got to give signaling that, believe it or not, 24-hour ketosis is not a good idea. And there's lots of reasons for that. We could spend a whole podcast about that, but it's a horrible idea. So you don't want to do this every day. I break it up on the weekends. I go back to really 2 meals a day, and so that I change up. Uh, do you have to do that? It's called eat one meal a day. EOMAD, some people call it OMAD. If you keep trying to do this, as I joke in the book, you will go mad because it's really hard to do. But most people who attempt to extend their non-eating window, their fasting period, most of us fall flat on our faces because, as I talk in the book, 80% of us are insulin resistant and metabolically inflexible. Now, I talk a lot about this in the book. Ordinarily, your mitochondria should be able to switch on a dime from using glucose as a fuel to using free fatty acids as a fuel. They have to they do it different ways, but normally it's like a hybrid car. If, the gasoline runs out, you're on battery, and vice versa. If the battery runs out, you're on gasoline. And mitochondria should be able to do this. Most of us, number one, we do not have that flexibility. We can't switch. Number two, 80% of us are insulin resistant, pre-diabetic, metabolically inflexible, whatever words we want to use. And sadly, when your insulin level is elevated, you may have plenty of fat that you'd like to go get to burn as a fuel, and your high insulin level will prevent you from getting to that fat. And it has a couple of enzyme systems that's really kind of cool, but it's water everywhere and not a drop to drink. So when I have someone say, "Oh, I'm going to start fasting," and they go, or "I'm going to do intermittent fasting and I won't eat until noon. And I used to eat at 7. Okay, tomorrow I'm not going to eat until noon." what happens is you can't get to those free fatty acids to start burning them in your mitochondria, and you fall flat on your face. You have no energy. Of course, you have no energy. You can't produce any. You're headachy, you're hangry. And most people say, intermittent fasting, that's not for me. I can't do that. What I do in the book is I go, no, no, no. You're right. You can't do that. And here's why you can't do that. So here's what you can do. If you eat breakfast at 7, tomorrow, let's have breakfast at 8. You can make it 1 hour. And then the next day, okay, we made it to 8. Let's try for 9. And we do this 1 hour at a time through a week. And then we take the weekend off. And then the next week, we start 1 hour later. So if we started breakfast at 8 the first week, we're starting it at 9. So we go through a 6-week period, and slowly but surely, we get you metabolically flexible so that by the end of 6 weeks, starting at noon is like, yeah, got that. I'm not hungry anymore. I feel great. I got so much energy. And that's what we want to have people do. We want to get people's energy back. And paradoxically, the shorter I can make the window of eating, when you start, when you break fast, and when you finish, the more energy your mitochondria will make. And it's a paradox, but again, there's really good mouse evidence and there's great human evidence that this works. And so, but it's getting to that point, and you just can't jump into the deep end. That's why all these fail.
So after 6 weeks, when you're metabolically flexible, you can now switch between sources of fuel for your mitochondria. At that point, is that when you'd recommend people wait to start exercising when they're fasting?
So, interestingly enough, when you're fasting, your exercise performance shockingly goes up rather than down. And it's one of the biggest mistakes people make. And I use the example that back when I was growing up, my mother would not allow my sister and I to go swimming for an hour after we ate breakfast or lunch because we would get cramps and die. And there were even actually TV commercials about this. Now, there was a bit of truth in that old wives' tale, and that's because, as I mentioned before, digestion takes a lot of energy. It takes a lot of blood flow down into our intestines. And so that blood flow is diverted to your intestines, and it's not available for your muscles. And so that smoothie that you had before you exercise is actually defeating the purpose, number one. And number two, it's been shown that exercising on an empty stomach, exercising fasting, and then having your meal 10 to 20 minutes after you finish exercising actually delivers more goods to your muscles and is a far better way to produce energy. One of the things that's interesting about fasting is you would think that a starving animal would have less energy, but we're designed that if we don't have a lot of food, our power, our running ability should actually increase. Because if we don't catch that animal, that's the end of things. And there's some really cool, endurance athlete performance, sprinters that show that their performance on a fasted state actually improves. Again, it's one of those paradoxes that when you finally start thinking about it, you go, oh, there might be an evolutionary advantage for me to have better performance when I don't have any food.
It makes sense when you think about it that way.
Yeah.
And Dr. Gundry, I know we're cutting it on time here. We only have a few more minutes, but I'm showing the cover of your book here because there's one thing I think we need to talk about before I let you go, and that's coffee. You picked a cup of coffee on the front. We did talk about coffee, but I want to get back into coffee. We haven't talked about it in the respect that this is what a lot of people use day in, day out when they're suffering from low energy. So talk about, how this obviously you're a fan of coffee and it's something
I
you
am.
consume, but how do we know, I guess, when it's becoming a crutch and when is coffee turn into a bad thing?
Well, interestingly enough, coffee actually doesn't make us awake. It actually temporarily stops sensations of being sleepy, but we reach a point where coffee has the opposite effect, and it actually causes sleepiness and drowsiness. And for instance, when I was a really busy heart surgeon, I was one of those people who, we viewed this as black stuff that kept us awake. But I could have, a double espresso at, 8 o'clock at night after dinner, and it would put me to sleep. And I'd show off saying, oh, I can handle coffee. Well, I had reached, the threshold of course, it would put me to sleep because it had now had a sedative effect. But the problem is we think that our normal lifestyles, we have to power through with double espressos, with energy drinks, with energy bars. And the point of the book is that these are warning signs that you're not supposed to have to do this to have energy. In fact, these are signs that, oh, hey, there's a light bulb that should go off saying, there's something wrong that I have to have these. And it's like, in conclusion, it's like I say, fatigue is not your fate. This is not what you're supposed to be doing. And, here's the steps to get back your energy.
I love it. This is an important conversation for a lot of people. Energy dips and not having enough energy is such a common problem, and I really enjoyed our conversation. Other than people getting a copy of the Energy Paradox, how can they connect with you after the show, Dr. Gundry?
Well, so you can go to my multiple websites, drgundry.com. My supplement and food company is gundrymd.com. You can find me on Instagram. I've got 2 YouTube channels. Subscribe to my email. I'm happy to send you some witty thing every day. And Go to Barnes and Noble, go to Amazon, find the book. Go to your local bookseller. The local booksellers were really hurting during COVID, and they're opening up now. And please, 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 help them out. Like all of our little small businesses, got to help them.
That makes sense. Okay, Dr. Gundry, I'm sure we'll chat again when the next book comes out.
I'm
This was a
working on it
great.
right now, Jesse.
I heard you talk about it. That's exciting. Can you give us a little heads up on what you're writing about?
It's actually it's uh, w- why let's put it this way: the good and bad of keto, the great stuff and the really bad stuff, and we're going to sort it out and give people actually a new way of doing keto. That's so exciting. I can't stand it. It's really exciting.
And will that come out in 2022?
We think it's going to release in December of this year. If I it's almost done, as a matter of fact. So we're hoping it'll be, a holiday book for this coming year,
Love it.
for this year.
Well, let's plan on chatting again when that goes live.
Great, great.
Okay,
Yeah,
Dr. Gundry.
it'll be fun. If you like blowing your mind with the energy paradox, I can guarantee you the new book will just crazy,
Well, like
crazy
I
stuff.
said at the beginning, favorite book of yours so far that I've
All
read, and
right, very good.
hopefully this next one will be even better. So, thank you for everything.
All right, thanks, Jesse. Good to see you.
Good to see you.